Now we're turning our attention to muscles of the upper limb, and muscles that connect the upper limb to the torso or the thorax. So immediately, the connection point being the pectoral girdle, we need to think of what muscles will connect the pectoral girdle to the thorax, or the rest of the body. So these muscles have a major role in stabilizing the girdle. Right? There's one bone-on-bone connection between the clavicle and the sternum, and the rest of that stability for the upper limb comes from the muscles that attach the girdle to the thorax. And in general, you can break them into anterior and posterior groups. Just wait 1 second. I keep getting an error message about the Wi-Fi, so I'm just turning that off. Generally, anterior and posterior groups. So we'll look anteriorly first, and there are muscles that span the shoulder joint that help to stabilize that aren't listed here, but because they're not just connected to the girdle, I'm saving those for later. They might span the entire shoulder joint. Right now I'm just looking for muscles that connect the thorax to the scapula, or to the clavicle. And one of the first ones is pec minor, pectoralis minor, which is not a well-known muscle. It's underneath the pectorals that you know. Pectoralis minor, you can see the origins here along ribs 3, 4, 5, and insertion on the coracoid process. Pretty obvious, even just from looking at this figure. And a lot of the nerves that we're going to talk about today, we've seen before. You might not remember them, but a lot of the nerves we'll talk about today arise from the brachial plexus. And the medial pec nerve is one of those nerves. If you think back to the song, something, 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 medial pec nerve arises. That's the nerve that innervates pectoralis minor. It comes from the medial cord of the brachial plexus, and it pierces pec minor. The nerve goes through the muscle, which is not so common. It happens sometimes. It's not so common though. That's a unique feature of pectoralis minor. I'm going to downplay blood supply in this section. We had a few examples in the thorax, and those will stand. Some of the arterial supply is very small. Some of the arteries are very small and difficult to understand without the context that we'll have with the app, for one. But names are pretty complicated and long, and they don't mean a whole lot. I will bring up major arteries in the arm, but for some small arterial supply, we're going to leave it. So you don't have to worry so much about the arterial supply for pec minor, and for a lot of other muscles as well. But understanding the connection points, origin and insertion, and then the innervation, because we've already covered that, we've introduced it before, is important. And a second anterior muscle is what we call serratus anterior. It's in the name. Serratus anterior, because from the outside looking in, the origin has a serrated edge look to it because of the multiple insertions on ribs 1 through 9, and the saw blade or sawtooth-like appearance of that muscle along the rib cage when you view it from the outside. Serratus anterior. Serratus anterior starts on the anterior and lateral aspects of the ribs, wraps all the way around the thoracic cage, under the shoulder blade, and inserts on the vertebral border of the scapula. So the medial border, the border closest to the spine, it crosses underneath the entire scapula and inserts on the vertebral border. This is one of the main muscles that's innervated by the long thoracic nerve. Long thoracic formed by C5 to 7. By now you should be in BP heaven. That's the closing remark of the last song. And this was the muscle, when we looked at some injuries, some common injuries of the brachial plexus. Winged scapula was one of those injuries. That's a result of damage to the long thoracic nerve, and then the inability to contract serratus anterior, and its job is to seat the scapula against the back of the thoracic cage. And if it can't do that, your scapula comes off. If you push against a wall, your scapula wings off of the back. So damage with the long thoracic nerve responsible for winged scapula. And again, we don't need to worry so much about blood supply. Small arteries, probably intercostal arteries if you were going to guess, being that they are in close proximity, but I'm not going to require you to know that for any exams. We can start to see, these are our two major anterior muscles. You can see some of the posterior muscles poking up. Trapezius is the major one of the major ones we'll talk about next. You can see that poking up over the superior border of the scapula. And if we turn our attention to it at the back, actually the book doesn't show a really nice version of trapezius as it appears in the body, so I'm overlaying one here. You've seen it in lab. Large origin, the length of the cervical spine, the thoracic spine, part of the occipital bone of the skull, and then insertion along the vertebral border and the spine of the scapula. Just this massive area covered by trapezius. Massive area. And even further back, before the brachial plexus, when we discussed cranial nerves, that's where we find the innervation for trapezius. The accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, innervates trapezius. And I have spinal in brackets. The old name, the old way to refer to the accessory nerve was spinal accessory. Some of the roots seem to come off of the brainstem or part of the spine. That's why the origin was blended for that nerve. And because I refer to it as spinal accessory in the song that you're going to hear. So to make that connection for you. Same nerve. And I didn't even go so far as to write out blood supply not applicable. Don't even worry about it. Trapezius, most superficial muscle of the back. That helps to secure the scapula to the thoracic cage. Obvious in many individuals. Many fibers, many directions, many actions on the scapula, but we're not going through those in depth. I want to look at one other series of posterior muscles. There are a couple more. We're not going to do them in depth, but the rhomboids, I think, are worth bringing up. They were a big focus of lab this week. They are named for their shape, a skewed parallelogram. They are rhomboid by nature. Both of them have similar innervation and blood supply. The innervation for rhomboid major and minor is the dorsal scapular nerve. Again, arising from the brachial plexus. Dorsal scapular comes off of C5 with a lyric in that song. C5, spinal root, very proximal or early in the brachial plexus, if you will. But that innervates both rhomboids, and major is under minor. Major name just for the size, it's bigger than minor, which is smaller. And that naming scheme holds up when we get to a second pair, the teres muscles, major and minor. Major underneath, minor on top. Don't worry about blood supply. Pretty obvious what the origins and insertions are. The spinous processes of the thoracic vertebrae and the vertebral border of the scapula. A unique landmark to help differentiate the two is the spine of the scapula that separates the two muscles. Major inserts below, minor inserts above. Honorable mention here to Levator Scapulae. If you go into AT, PT, some kind of therapy, Levator Scap smells like crap is often a phrase you'll hear to stretch Levator Scap down and then to either side. Levator Scap smells like crap. Very common muscle that's often very tight with lots of stress. Complemented by scalene eye to the sky, but I digress. Honorable mention, no details about Levator Scap. We're going to leave that as our discussion of muscles that anchor the girdle, the pectoral girdle. Now, moving distal from the girdle, the next major connection, the humerus, the shoulder joint, muscles of the shoulder joint, or muscles that move the humerus. There are 9 muscles that cross the shoulder joint and articulate with the humerus. 7 of them arise from the scapula. 2 of them do not. 2 of them come from the thoracic cage themselves, or the torso, the body themselves. And we are going to look not at all of them, don't worry. The 2 that don't arise from the scapula are Pectoralis major, Latissimus Dorsi, 2 of the most obvious, largest muscles in the body. Pectoralis major you can't really see very well in the textbook. It's always cut. It's cut away, it's open to show the underlying structures. If we had a nice 3D representation, you could see all the fibers spanning from the sternocostal border across all of these underlying structures to the humerus itself. So the sternum, the clavicle, the manubrium, all the origins of pectoralis major. I have insertion on here specifically. Pectoralis major, like pectoralis minor, medial pec nerve, but also lateral pec nerve. Medial and lateral pectoral nerves both arise from the brachial plexus, innervate this large muscle. And they're named for the cords from which they arise in the brachial plexus. Medial cord and lateral cord give rise to the medial and lateral pectoral nerves, respectively. And that's important because if you look at them side by side, the orientation is the reverse of what the names suggest. And so you have to imagine that now. You can't see it. I would show you that if we had access. But the medial pec nerve is more lateral in the anatomical position to the lateral pec nerve. They're named for the cords from which they arise, not their positions in the body, which is somewhat confusing. I acknowledge that. Let's not worry about blood supply. You can see the origin here, the sternocostal border and the clavicle. Everything inserts on the greater, or the crest of the greater tubercle of the humerus. And what I mean by crest is you can kind of picture the greater tubercle as an upside down teardrop. The tubercle, and there's a little trailing edge inferior to the tubercle when you look at the humerus. And that trailing edge is the crest. Not on the bulb of the tubercle itself, but on the linear portion, the crest, just inferior to the tubercle. And you can kind of make it out here. You see the pectoralis major muscle cut away. There's the greater tubercle. This is the crest just inferior, just a line extending down on either side of that intertubercular sulcus. We're using our imaginations today. One of the two muscles that doesn't arise from the scapula. We're putting Latissimus Dorsi on hold till we get to the back. Let's move to muscles that originate from the scapula. And by far the most obvious is the deltoids muscle. You can really group them in three groups or three heads. They're not defined heads, but three parts of the deltoid muscle arise from the clavicle, the acromion, and the spine of the scapula. And they all insert at one specific point. Deltoid, all heads or all areas, are innervated by the axillary nerve. Axillary nerve on top all alone. It's easy to be seen and to be shown. Axillary nerve off of the posterior cord of the brachial plexus. And the axillary nerve actually takes an interesting path through a structure that we're going to call the quadrangular space. There's a little box that is created by some muscles on the back of the humerus. And I'm not going to tell you more about it now, just that it's called the quadrangular space. 4 angles, it's a square, and I'll show you that when we get there. But the axillary nerve goes through that space with the artery that supplies the deltoids. We're breaking our trend now. The deltoid muscles are supplied by some long convoluted arteries, the anterior and posterior circumflex humeral arteries. If we parse that out and break it down, it means there are branches in front and behind that wrap around the humerus. That's all the name says. One branch goes in front of the humerus, the other branch goes behind. Anterior and posterior circumflex humeral arteries. I only bring these up because the posterior circumflex humeral artery goes through the quadrangular space with the axillary nerve. They run through that square together. So if you see a presentation, a picture on an exam or in a lab exam of an obvious space that you would identify as the quadrangular space, and there's an artery and a nerve going through, you know what they are. Axillary nerve, posterior circumflex humeral artery, PCHA. And I'll come back to that in the song, hence the emphasis. These are incidentally branches off of the axillary artery, which is the major artery in the arm. Subclavian, or axillary brachial artery, major artery supplying the entire arm. These are small tributaries of that. And while there's a very large origin around almost the entire girdle, insertion at one singular point, you might have guessed, deltoid tuberosity. Lateral aspect, half of the way down on the humerus, one raised, bumpy, roughened surface, deltoid tuberosity. All fibers converged there through the deltoid tendon. Now this is going to be more difficult with only this picture, but because we've taken the time to articulate some of the surfaces of the scapula, it's worth noting here, Subscapularis arises from the subscapular fossa. It's in the name. It's really hard to see. It's behind everything on the anterior surface of the scapula, sub or under the scapula. And it loops in front of the humerus and inserts on the lesser tubercle. So this is part of one of the small muscles that anchors the humerus in the shoulder joint. Subscapularis and some of the other muscles do as well, but this is the first. And I suppose I'm not going to make a big deal out of origins and insertions. I'm not showing you that information. I just want to bring it up because we've talked about the subscapular fossa, which would be here. And this muscle spans in front to the lesser tubercle. Also notice you can start to see one of the teres muscles, which we'll address when we get to the back. Teres major, under minor, just like the rhomboids. Has a similar path to subscapularis. Teres major. It's hard to see, so we're not going to really focus on it right now. Those follow a very similar path, inserting in a very similar location, lesser tubercle, crest of the lesser tubercle, to seat the humerus in the shoulder joint. Let's turn our attention to the back. I am dissatisfied with the level of detail that we can cover today, but I suppose it's not bad news for those of you trying to study for the final, study for any tests. When you look at the back, at muscles that anchor or move the humerus, first thing you notice, the largest muscle on the back, or one of the largest muscles, probably in the entire body, Trapezius, Latissimus Dorsi, Gluteus Maximus, bisurface area. Latissimus Dorsi, obviously a large muscle. Not immediately clear here how it articulates with the humerus, but it does. And I'll show you how in a second. Latissimus Dorsi, the lats. Lat pull down. Lat pull down works, Latissimus Dorsi. Latissimus Dorsi, innervated by the thoracodorsal nerve, which is in and of itself a hard word or nerve to remember, but it's somewhat easier when you understand that the artery supplying Latissimus Dorsi is of the same name. So you memorize one, you memorize both. Biggest muscle group. It spans, its attachments span the dorsal aspect of thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, sacral vertebrae, the iliac crest and the ilium. This entire area is the origin of Latissimus Dorsi. Thoracodorsal makes sense if you think about what that suggests. And you'll have to imagine this muscle wrapping around the lateral aspect of the thoracic cage, around the ribs, and inserting on the intertubercular sulcus, the floor of the intertubercular sulcus. Wraps all the way around, underneath the axilla, to the front of the humerus. That's how it articulates the humerus. All the way from the back, underneath my arm, through the axilla to the front of the humerus, between the two tubercles. Have you done lat pull down before and you felt when you got near the end that you wanted to round your shoulders? That's this action. The lats pulling down, but then as you get to the end, pulling the anterior surface of the humerus down and in because of this path of the muscle. So, largest muscle, of note, interesting path as well. On the right side, like subscapularis, we've introduced two other surfaces on the dorsum of the scapula, the infraspinous fossa and the supraspinous fossa. little depressions below the spine of the scapula and above, respectively. And if you remember the names of those surfaces, the muscles that arise there will be easy to remember as well. Infraspinous fossa gives rise to infraspinatus, this big guy or gal. Supraspinous fossa gives rise to supraspinatus. And it's really easy, this is really easy because the surface identifies the muscle, and the nervous and arterial supply is the same for both. Both are supplied by the suprascapular nerve. And so maybe it's becoming clear why I spent time on Tuesday showing you the suprascapular ligament that closes off the suprascapular notch. And then we talked about how an artery goes through that hole. A nerve goes through that hole. The nerve that goes through the suprascapular notch is the suprascapular nerve. This guy, or girl. Again, we've seen it before from the brachial plexus. After it comes over the notch, it spreads over the supraspinous surface, and then it loops around the edge of the spine of the scapula, and then on the surface, the infraspinous fossa, innervating both muscles. Easy peasy. Blood supply, same thing. Suprascapular artery supplies supraspinatus, supplies infraspinatus, of the same name as the nerve. Easy to remember. Suprascapular artery also goes near the notch, but one important distinction, that ligament, nerve underneath, artery above. All suprascapular, they're all named the same, artery above and nerve underneath the ligament through the notch. Imagine that you can see that. Both of these travel in tandem across the surface of the scapula, over the head of the humerus, onto the greater tubercle. Around the shoulder, inserting on the greater tubercle, the lateral surface of the humerus. And these make up a significant complement of what we call the rotator cuff. The muscles that span from the scapula to the humerus and help with external rotation, secure the humerus in the glenoid cavity. These are two major muscles of that rotator cuff. So we'll leave our exploration there with respect to scapular muscles and muscles that articulate the humerus. I'm also cutting short, not that we're not done yet, but I am going to cut short our discussion of muscles that move the radius and ulna, because you've seen this at length in lab, or you will today. I'm only going to introduce the major players in movement of the radius and ulna, and only so that I can show you what the quadrangular space is, really. You'll know more from lab, and I'll expect you to know more for the exam, but the major muscles, of course, are the flexors and extensors of the elbow, the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii. They're on the brachial, or in the brachial compartment of the arm. Biceps, like Matt's alluded to, seps referring to head, biceps, two heads. Biceps brachii has two heads. innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve, which we saw again on the brachial plexus. This is the projection of the lateral cord. As it left the brachial plexus, it went into the arm to supply, among some other things, the biceps brachii. Biceps brachii. Musculocutaneous might take a bit of mental flexibility to remember, but brachial artery supplying the biceps brachii follows suit. That holds up. Brachial artery is the terminal, maybe not branch, but it's what's left of the axillary artery as it comes into the arm. We'll put it that way. This is the major artery supplying the rest of the arm. Branches come off of the brachial artery. If you've ever tried to feel your pulse by putting your fingers under the biceps near the humerus, that pulse that you're feeling is the brachial artery pulse. You gotta get really in there. And I'm probably a bit more active and engaged than you, but if you're really quiet, relaxed, you can probably feel that. If you're thinking back to the bones that we talked about, we've already mentioned its insertion. The origins, I'm not pointing out here, but the insertions, radial tuberosity of the ulna. Of course not. No, the radius. Radial tuberosity of the radius. Right here. Radial tuberosity of the radius. Two heads, lateral and long. I always remember long is lateral. L's match up. Long head is lateral. And that leaves short head medial. Long head is lateral. If we turn our attention to the flexor, major flexor of the elbow, major extensor of the elbow. I heard some of you catching that, which is good. Triceps brachii, following suit, 3 heads. Long, lateral, and medial. That naming scheme doesn't hold up here. Long is not lateral. It makes sense that lateral is lateral. And that leaves long on the superficial, in the superficial aspect. And medial, you have to remember, is deep, right on the surface of the humerus, below these 2 obvious heads of the triceps. At first glance, it looks like there are only 2 heads. Medial is underneath these 2. These are also innervated by musculocutaneous nerve, but also the radial nerve. So, one small difference in innervation. Blood supply is the same. Brachial artery supplies both the triceps and the biceps brachii. Smaller tributaries coming off with more specific names we can pick out if we want to, but we're going to call them brachial arteries. And in order to extend the elbow, the insertion point of all 3 heads is the olecranon process of the ulna, the pointy part of the elbow, as you well know. Now there are a few other slides that you'll have in your slide set. I only want to bring this next one up to show you the arrangement of the heads of the triceps. Notice medial, just on the upper portion, the upper surface of the bone, the immediate posterior aspect of the humerus, covered entirely by the lateral and long heads. You knew this already, you've seen it in lab, just wanted to point this out to you here. And we're not going to discuss at length brachialis, brachioradialis, or that's coming up. We're not discussing the rest at length. We're going to spend a lot of time tomorrow discussing muscles of the forearm and muscles of the hand, so we might refer back